So I'm appreciative of all the animals that are coming on. As I say, it just humanizes us, reminds us that we have full lives. And we will put into the chat some links to these stories. And we did more detailed sessions on the encampment experience in Vancouver in its as it unfolded. And I think that that's part of the lessons for us, right? Is that we did COVID 100, 200, 300, 365. My colleague Kate Graham is joining, and she's going to talk a little bit about our most recent experience. But the interesting thing is these are points in time, and we've seen changes in those points in time, right? And we've seen things evolve, and what may have looked to be the right thing when we were 100 days in or 350 days in might feel quite different to now we're 1,000 days in. So we have, as you can see, an illustrious group gathering here to help us parse this for the next 50 minutes, including my colleague from the CUI board, Marcy Burchfield, who's going to help with the moderation. And then Peter Sloly, who's a new fellow with us at CUI. You can see all the bios for everybody that they'll be put in the chat. Peter, nice to see you. Peter's in Ottawa. I'm assuming Tim's in the Big Smoke, New York City. Also a colleague with us on the whole notion of urban commerce and public space and animating main streets. And Alicia, nice to see you from San Francisco, your own set of challenges that we're keen to hear about. And Graham from the sunny Ville de Quebec. So we're appreciative for all of you to be joining us for the next 50 minutes. And I'm going to pass to Kate first. Kate Graham, who's here, who wears a gazillion different hats, but came to CUI actually initially as a volunteer. Kate, can you believe it? In the spring of 20, came to me, I was new in the job, and she said, I think we need to start tracking what municipal governments are doing. Have you got bandwidth to think about that? And we started City Watch and then started to build from there. And Kate's gone on to do 19 different things since then. But she's back with us to talk about an exercise that she led people through. So I'm going to pass it to you, Kate, to talk for a few minutes about your experience. And then I'll open it up to all of us to talk about what we think the COVID dividend will be. So Kate, over to you.
Sounds good. Well, thanks very much, Mary, for the invitation to be here. Not many people can moderate for 4 hours solid. Mary, you've got a unique gift, and so it's.
I have help. Marcy, I've got reinforcement. Marcy's helping. Yeah. Very
good. Okay, so can you see this? Did that work? Okay, perfect. All right. So as Mary said, I have the privilege this morning of sharing a little bit about a reflection on the past 1,000 days. And I don't know about all of you, but when I think back to 1,000 days ago, I am so glad that I didn't know that 1,000 days later, we would still be talking about this. That was a chaotic, disruptive, confusing. There was so much that we didn't know. And the effort kind of behind all of this reflection work as we hit these important milestones is to sort of stop for a moment and say, okay, wait a second, big things are happening here. What should we be taking away from this moment? How can we find the seeds that we know are often found in crisis of progress, of transformation? So CUI has really been living this over the last 1,000 days. For those of you who have been following this work, in addition to what Mary already shared, CUI has published a report under what's called the signpost series, signpost meaning something to provide clarity in a confusing environment or to provide direction. So the first report came out 100 days into COVID, then 200 days, then 300 days, then 365. Mary, I don't know what happened after that. I think it was too depressing or overwhelming to keep doing them. But here we are now that we've hit the 1,000-day milestone, which again feels like an important moment to stop and reflect. So to help inform and just give a little bit of framing to the conversation that lies ahead over the next hour, CUI issued a call to ask Canadians to share a bit about what these 1,000 days have been like for them in their own communities. If you haven't had a chance to do this yet, it's still open and it will be open for the next couple of weeks. The link is at the bottom. You can find it on the CUI website. It feels sort of like a FaceTime with Mary, and like who wouldn't want that? You can respond to 5 questions in text, in video, or using audio, and tell us a little bit about what these 1,000 days have been like for you. And I'm going to take just a couple of minutes here and tell you a bit about what we've heard so far through this process. So about 500 people have taken the time to tell us about their 1,000-day experience, which is equivalent to about 2,500 responses. Lots of stories, lots of anecdotes, lots of really rich content that boils down for a researcher like me to 43,000 words to be able to analyze. And to give you sort of a global perspective on this, one of the easy things to do with content like this is to just do a quick analysis of what kind of sentiments are being reflected. Are people feeling positively or negatively about the topic? And what you see here on the right is that this is kind of a mixed bag, and a slight lean towards positivity, maybe more indicative of the positive framing of the questions being future oriented and so on. But people shared with us that they have had a whole range of experiences from, catastrophic loss to really important moments of revelation and transformation in their lives, in their organizations, and in their communities. And if I can be even a little bit more pointed about this, there are tools to be able to analyze big amounts of data and really draw out from words and combinations of words, what are the things that people are feeling? And the important part here, if you haven't seen a diagram like this, is usually one or two base emotions pop out when you do things like this. What you see here is the opposite of that. People have been feeling all the feels, right? Combined, emotions ranging from surprise, joy, anger, anticipation, fear. For most of us, this has been an absolute roller coaster. And that was one of the words that came up more often than we expected. So, and even those of you in the conversation in the chat, it'd be good to hear from you, like, what are the emotions that you have been feeling? Because my guess is, at least for me and many that I know, it does kind of reflect this, it has been a wild ride of 1,000 days with very low lows and very high highs. Okay, so let me cut to the chase here. So we have heard from 500 people, a lot of really insightful things shared. There are 5 things that leap off the page as being important observations that Canadians have shared with us. And I'd like to just walk through those quickly. So number 1, in normal times, I think most of us have a pretty high awareness of big problems going on in the world around us, but there's this sort of sense that like somebody else is handling a lot of those things. And during the pandemic, what we could sort of loosely categorize as being the bystander effect, where people sort of stand by hoping somebody else takes care of it. This was interrupted. And instead, people stepped up to do unusual, amazing things. This included from vaccine hunters to the caremongering groups to organizations stepping outside their mandate. The examples that people have shared with us all across the country are hella inspiring. And it turns out that the people who are willing to step outside their normal work to help people and help in their community emerge as being the heroes of the pandemic. Lots of mention, of course, of frontline healthcare workers, frontline workers generally, people who went above and beyond in their jobs, or people who stepped outside of their normal work entirely. And if you roll it up to kind of a bigger scale, thinking about our public institutions, government, and so on, what we learned and what a lot of people commented on was it turns out that things we've been talking about and that seemed intractable or like we weren't able to make progress, all of a sudden change was possible. SPUR is a good example. We've been talking about basic income in this country since the 1960s. And within a very short time, an instrument was actually delivered and providing support for people. And there are many examples like that at all levels of government where all of a sudden mountains were moving. The important thing to what we were hearing from people about this is I think that there is an expectation now that governments in particular are able to move faster and be able to respond to issues much quicker, because now we've seen that they can. The sort of fallacy of government moving slowly was removed. And so I think it changes our expectations and perceptions of government across the polls. Number 3, and this one has been already a strong theme of the conversations today, laid painfully clear in plain sight in front of us was the inequities that already existed. Even in the COVID 100 report, this was the punchline, was that our experiences were depending on who we are and where we live, and existing inequities and oppressions were being intensified. So we cannot wait until there is a crisis. We should expect that when things as dramatic as this happen, that those inequalities will be deepened. So addressing them outside of times of crisis is really, really important. And again, something that a lot of people mentioned in their responses. Okay, number 4, and this exists at a lot of scales, those little nagging things that were bothering us, little challenges, in times of crisis can become total catastrophes. This ranges from like little family and friend dynamics or issues within organizations, all the way up to things like the housing crisis or mental health. Where we had, cracks in our systems, those became even more apparent and even more urgent, and in a time where we were less equipped to be able to resolve them. And then the last one, and again, kind of a theme that we've already heard today, over and over and over again, the secret sauce of being able to respond to crisis was identified as being collaboration. So organizations that could figure out new ways of working. The last conversation Mary was talking about people just showing up and breaking down the system. Where we saw that happening was where transformation rests. And so a really important lesson from the past 1,000 days that surely has great applicability for the 1,000 ahead and beyond. So the final thing I will leave you on, this is a quote I know many of us have heard Mary say, or a phrase, the DIY city, where in crisis, we saw people having the agency and ability to solve problems and step outside their role. We saw governments moving quickly. We saw new collaborations forming. We saw greater attention on issues that had been there before. And in a moment where in our cities, we have huge, important issues from inequality to climate change and so many more, how do we carry this sense of urgency, personal agency, all the way up to transformative policy change? How do we carry those things forward? I think if I was to put all of the things that we heard from 500 people so far into a sentence, it would be this. This is the call to action for cities going forward, is to keep our foot on the gas and push as hard as we can, not just in responding to the crisis of the pandemic, but in responding to urban crises generally. And with that, I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Kate. I'm glad you've got keep the foot on the gas. That is the challenge that we are all struggling with. And I'm interested, I'm going to ask you a couple questions and then I'll pass to Marcy, who will do the roundtable with folks here. But and we're interested in hearing from each of you what you think the key COVID lessons are going forward and what you've observed. Kate, one quick question. Do you think people, and I would encourage people to go to the link and do the questionnaire. Unfortunately, you have my face in your face. But it does finish. But the good thing is it does make all of us just take a moment and try to see if we can glean learnings. And we heard Ahmed on a previous session, two before, say he's worried that we've already forgotten the lessons we've learned. So do you think, Kate, from your perspective, are people willing to actually do the tough reflection? Are we over it enough that we can actually say this worked and this didn't? Or did you find that people were still in it and hard to see?
I think we have this combination. Like I'm not sure. On one hand, I do think we see evidence that people are tired. They're done. Like everything from low voter turnout, like general lack of trust and so on. People are feeling pretty exhausted. On the other hand, I think in a moment where people have had to reflect on what actually matters to them, what kind of life do you want to lead? Where do you want to live? How do you want to move? All of those questions have been front and center. And especially where people have been inspired personally or by those around them to do great things and have more of an impact in the place where they live. I hope that's a lingering motivation, that even though we're tired, even though it's been a long 1,000 days, we have it in us to be able to do things that we don't normally do. So how do we use that as a driver to say, okay, we got this whole host of things, let's keep pushing.
Yep.
As long as I say, I don't know.
Marcy, I'm going to go over to you to do the tour de table here. Thanks for joining us. Always.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, perfect. Great, thanks, Mary. And I agree with Kate there. Your hosting skills I cannot match, but I will try. So thanks, Kate. That was really interesting. As she said, people can still fill out the survey to get more data, as all great researchers love to gather this this information, both survey and to cross check it with sort of what other tabular data that we can measure stuff by. So I have the pleasure of introducing the panelists and asking them to reflect on some sort of, I would say, a combination of what Kate presented, but also lessons learned in your own communities and in your own experiences. So maybe I will start with Alicia from San Francisco. Are you on the line? I can't see everyone here. Yeah. Great. So maybe we could start with you all the way in the West Coast and hear what's happening in San Francisco.
Thank you, Marcy, and thank you all for asking me to be here today. It's great to be with you all. That was a super interesting presentation. I think in terms of lessons learned, I would sort of boil it down to a couple of buckets. And one is from the standpoint of place. I think what we learned in the COVID experience was how important, what a significant force the desire for community connection has on place. What we saw throughout the course of the pandemic was that the places that performed the best were the ones where people actually could access their connection to other people. So whether that was people coming out to pick up takeout from their local restaurant because they wanted to make sure that that restaurant stayed in business, or the success of outdoor dining or slow streets, converting streets into spaces that people could just occupy. What we saw was this strong desire for people to be able to remain connected. And I think, looking at the results that you shared, Kate, that spectrum of feelings that people have held, it's no surprise that what people were seeking was community connection. I think also what we saw was that diversity was really our strength during COVID, that, from a place standpoint, the places that had the most kind of dense mixed use offerings were those that performed the best, and places like downtown San Francisco, which were primarily office-based, completely hollowed out and frankly have not recovered their role as a center point for the region, even 1,000 days in. So there's that aspect of it. I think also when we started to see people exercise choice about where to be during this time, what was drawing them together was both where folks felt like they belonged and also where they found cultural vibrancy. And so as we think about the next kind of stages and how we kind of reconceive our cities in this era of choice, and of course, not everybody has choice, to be very clear about that, but millions of people do, and particularly in an economy like ours in the Bay Area, when we think about sort of a future of choice, I think we need to be really focused on community connection and cultural vibrancy as the path forward from a planning and land use standpoint. The other thing I want to speak to is this idea that we can move mountains. I think we did very much see that when we have a sense of urgency and focus and resources, because resources are often the missing component, when we have those three things, we can change things overnight. We saw that happen in the United States with the expansion of the child tax credit, sort of our version of a guaranteed income, millions of kids lifted out of poverty. But what we're faced with now is, from my perspective, this gap between how our value set and our goals and our aspirations expanded so dramatically during the pandemic, and a large part thanks to the social justice movements that really gained force during that time period. What we believe we should be able to accomplish is significantly greater than it was 2 or 3 years ago, but our skill set hasn't caught up. And so I think we run the risk of falling into cynicism, falling into despair, falling into grief. And it's going to be important for us as a community of civic actors to sustain that sort of sense of grace, that sense of innovation, that sense of we can do this together, while our skill set, while our policy understanding catches up to the new set of goals that we've created for ourselves. So that's what I'm thinking about as we're moving forward.
Great, thank you, Alicia. Appreciate that. And the desire for community connections, I think, was very much felt here, and is still is in Toronto. Maybe Peter, I'll go to you. Peter.
Thanks very much, Marcy. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Great session, and I'm grateful to Mary and the Canadian Urban Institute folks for bringing me on board as a visiting fellow. Very excited to start my formal role on this session, and I'm learning a lot as we go through it. There was the global pandemic. There was sort of the second pandemic, mental health and addictions. And I'm just going to quickly go through a couple of these sort of subset of pandemics that we're still dealing with 1,000 days into it. The economic pandemic, inflation, recession, and all the other tensions that go with it. Race and marginalized communities. I think Kate gave some great stats. Alicia referenced this, that this just became that much more clear to so many other people who, rather than talking about a crime problem where usually issues of race get raised, we're talking about a health problem, and then a whole range of other issues. So I think it brought it into the forefront of people's minds in new ways that were very impactful, both in not just in the public sector and not-for-profit sector, but I think right across broader society. I would say there was another pandemic very specific to policing and very relevant to the lived experience of racialized or marginalized communities, and that was the effect of the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, which happened months after the onset of the global pandemic. From a policing and public safety standpoint, it was a massively disruptive event on top of a series of massively disruptive events that were taking place in the years leading up to this and going back. But that one, in the midst of the global pandemic, as broadly traumatic as it was, I think had a deep disruptive impact on policing, one greater than I've ever seen before in my 30 years in policing. Certainly the summary that Kate gave, the bystander effect, I'm sort of doing a deeper dive now into the policing and public safety context, and I'll try to come back up again and give some bigger lessons learned. We saw that both on the community side, people taking a much more active role in addressing things like the opioid crisis, not just within the downtown core and the service providers, but just average citizens here in Ottawa and across the country, being far more keenly aware of a range of issues, and certainly public safety, public health issues, and being far more active in engaging, not necessarily calling the police, but engaging in constructive activities that led to a range of better outcomes, different outcomes that complemented and in some cases accelerated beyond where the police could go. Mountains move. The justice system was extremely reticent to use digital platforms for accelerating and moving people through the justice system and avoiding incarceration levels and trying to get people through their judicial processes. And so the use of technology by judges, by courts, significantly accelerated. Systemic inequities, again, I think we could go on and on. I think the reference to George Floyd's murder and so many other aspects around that were clearly front and center in the minds of policing and justice leaders and the officials and oversight bodies that address them. The nagging challenges and cracks, again, I'm not looking for a lot of sympathy here, but the reality is most police agencies in north and south of the border were built back 60, 70 years ago. Were modernized to the level of probably the 1980s and 90s, and certainly never made it into the millennium. And the pandemic and all the other sub-pandemics and other effects I've talked about exposed those cracks, and they became major catastrophes in so many ways. I'm not for a moment suggesting, a need to divide the pie further and figure out how to advance policing in the justice system while we advance all the other areas of society that are so much in need. But I think, as Kate referenced, if we don't now recognize those catastrophes and do something material to address them, it will happen again and again in more quicker ways and more catastrophic ways. So somehow we're going to have to figure out to maintain that urgency of accelerating, of raising all the boats in the harbor, rather than just trying to figure out which boats will sink and which ones will swim. Effective collaboration, I think I would just take that to a step further, effective integration. We certainly see now that the healthcare system can't handle this on their own. The policing system can't handle it on their own. The education system, we can't do this on our own. So greater integration, greater collaboration, a greater sense of urgency around that are the areas that I think we really need to focus on. Last but not least, and I just appreciate Alicia's comment, there is an expectation gap. We did some amazing things. We survived some incredibly traumatic things. And there's an urgency to keep going and a need to keep going, but there is a lot of burnout. There is systemic level burnout, there's institutional burnout, there's individual burnout. How do we keep that sense of urgency, that fierce sense of urgency always turned on when the reality is we are just about emptied out individually and institutionally? So it's a challenge I don't have an answer to, but I'm willing and to put my shoulder to the wheel, behind CUI's efforts here and see what we can do to move things forward. And I'm, again, grateful for the opportunity to be here and hope I can continue to contribute on the session.
That's great. Thank you so much, Peter. And you know, I think this idea of we've gone through multiple pandemics, I really feel like many of us have felt that. But this idea of this deep disruptive in an impact on policing and the criminal justice system, and tying that to resources needed to bring things to the 20th century versus 21st century, really, I think great observations. So I will move over to Graham, over to you.
Thanks so much, Marcy. And again, to everybody for this great time together. Peter, I'm so inspired by what you said. And I know we have our beautiful bios on there. I'm also a priest in the church, okay? I'm a priest of the Anglican Church from the UK. That's where a lot of my perspective on urban work comes from, that level. And one of our greatest supporters for our work in creating the Trinity Centers Foundation served as the head of counterterrorism for the British government. And he wrote in favor of our work. He said this, Peter Wilson, he said, building and facilitating genuine and authentic community networks has proven to be the most effective way of growing social cohesion and countering the toxic narrative of extremism and organized crime. So that's from the head MI5 and MI6 counterterrorism reported to Peter. And his answer was all of the police resources that were there, all of the surveillance resources, none of them were as effective as the building of resilient local community. We've heard that from Kate. And if we go out and think, if we wanted to get some of that, where could we buy some? And we might go to government and realize there are many willing partners in multiple layers of government, but it's not something that they're very willing to deliver all the time. There are other stakeholders who does this, who has budget for it, which I think is a key question for our day today. And really, if we then want social workers to do it, realize the budget problems are even harder. And we get down to us as local stakeholders, realizing what would we do. For many social issues, and I loved what was said earlier on parks, and also, I've just been loving this whole day so far. The question I have is, to what extent do we need the social sector? Do we need charities and nonprofits? That's what I'm bringing to the conversation today. In Canada, that's about 170,000 organizations. And of those, we know from data sources like Imagine Canada, the Ontario Nonprofit Network, the Canada Revenue Agency, and others. And Mary's been on my case about some new data compilations. We're working on some of that. We know that the overall cost of running a charity in Canada was rising at far above the rate of inflation before the pandemic. We also know that occupancy cost, the cost of being in a physical central location, urban or rural, was increasing faster than that overall rate of overall expenditure. Granting was trying to catch up, but it wasn't catching up fast enough. We don't have good enough data since the pandemic, but what we know roughly is that inflation has hit the social sector very hard, and it's also had a massive impact on its main force, or one of its main drivers, which are volunteers. So we have occupancy costs going through the roof for the social sector, revenues going down, and we're counting on this sector to do a lot, right? We deal with issues of homelessness, food security. We used to call, Peter, in England, we used to call this the urban trinity, okay? The urban trinity, we called the police services, the municipalities, and the rest of the social sector. And we called it the urban trinity because we realized we relied on each other. The social sector, folks, in Canada is really struggling with its operating model. It's same as you said, Peter, the police force is trying to modernize. It's taken a huge hit. Our work with churches is looking at churches as the largest single stock of real estate within the social sector. Does that make sense? So we talk a lot in these circles on commercial real estate and the realities of high street. I really appreciate what CUI has done over these 1,000 days to bring libraries, churches, parks into this conversation so that we can sit as equals to talk about Main Street. And just to give you, and then hand back to you on this, Marcy, to give everybody a bit of a snapshot, we have 12,000 places of worship in Canada. That's about 3 for every 10,000 people in Canada, 3 for every neighborhood. Does that make sense? Of those, at least one of those is in crisis in every neighborhood in Canada. And many of them you already know. The typical story is church sells, condo tower is built. I think, well, it's housing. Is it the kind of housing we wanted? And what kind of mixity, biodiversity, if I may say, as we're here in the middle of the COP15 conference here in Montreal, what did we lose? What we realized is we lose all the places for addiction cessation. We lose all the youth clubs. anything remotely ethnic that has no chance of paying commercial rents is based out of those places. Go to any movie and you look at all those groups, where do those groups gather? They gather in the church basement. We know it. So when we lose those spaces, we're losing a type of diversity that we need to deal with. And just jumping ahead to a question I know has been asked earlier, what could we ask government for? I want to say this. I would first of all thank our federal government for what they've done and the supports that have been given. And I'm so thankful and excited for the Federal Social Finance Fund. This is $755 million. It's coming up soon. And we as the social sector, particularly on the real estate side, we are ready and we're trying to do this. So it's in terms of collaboration, rather than just say we need more collaboration, which I know we all do. I also want to say in this couple of minutes, please join us. We're trying to gather some of the big players on this and really come up with a strategy for social purpose real estate around Canada. So big learnings, we need to collaborate. We need those spaces. We have them. We're losing them. We could keep them. We're here, we're ready to go. The conversations have actually sharpened over the pandemic period. We haven't had to wait for conferences. We just jumped on Zoom, sometimes because Mary's called us and said, hey, you, and you, get on Zoom now. And we just obeyed, and we will continue to obey, Mary. Thank you.
There you go, Mary. Lots of followers there. Thank you, Graham. That was excellent. And this idea of the urban trinity, I loved. First time I've heard that, and it's great to it's a great image. Bruce, over to you.
Well, first of all, it's great to be with everyone. This is the Mary rule. Just get on Zoom. It's really interesting just to think about the last 1,000 days, because I think we're dealing with a lot of these implications, obviously, of COVID, around spatial impacts, the remote work, supply chain, production networks, but also the unveiling of these intense racial and ethnic disparities, class disparities. We're also dealing, I think, with long-standing dynamics around technological advances, the climate crisis, the financialization of housing, which in many respects has gotten worse during this period, but it's been not as focused on as some of the immediate and the more urgent effects. I want to come back to the housing piece. In the US, obviously, we're dealing with a fire hose of money from the federal government. The federal government is snapped back to some functionality, though now it'll be divided government again. But that has caused its own anxiety, because the federal government is delivering programs and investments through literally hundreds of programs across dozens of agencies. It's a Rubik's Cube of programming that just assumes there's capacity out there, when in many places there's not. And then the last piece I'll just say is the Ukraine. I think the geopolitical issues here, we're moving back to a divided world, where globalization and this notion that what stays in your own national territory and what becomes partnered with others around the world is now being tested because of Russia and because of China. And so all this put together, I think, is giving us a crash course on federalism. Which level of government does what. No one in the US has a clue, frankly, because we just don't spend a lot of time ever talking about federalism. And it's also a crash course on localism. Which sector does what, to Graham's point. Just a few thoughts about challenges and opportunities. I think we are coming out of this crisis in the United States, and this may be Canada as well, with the housing market being structurally changed. We are seeing technologies come into housing which allow investors domestically and globally to pinpoint what they want to buy and where. And then, particularly in the single family home market, large shares of properties are being transferred to institutional investors and corporate landlords that are basically using this moment and supply constraints to just boost rents on vulnerable populations all across the board. We're going to wake up from all this and basically be in a new world of who owns what, in the United States in particular, but perhaps beyond. And we don't really know how to respond to this. Because again, responsibility is divided and fragmented across different layers of government and different sectors of society. No one's in charge, right? So the private investor community has found a new asset class, single family homes, right? To come in, crowd out home buyers, change the character of neighborhoods, and basically make evictions, a feature of their investments. I mean, you cannot make this stuff up, to tell you the truth. I mean, it is just absolutely pernicious and amoral, immoral, whatever the hell you want to call it. So that's on, hello, Houston or Washington or Ottawa. We have a problem here. We have financialized the housing sector to a point where we don't have the tools to respond anymore. And this is global money, not just domestic capital. On the positive side, because just let that sink in for a second, but on the positive side, I do think the electrification of the auto sector, decarbonizing of the built environment is going to create enormous opportunities for research, commercialization, business expansion, business formation, job creation, workforce, wealth creation, all of it. Is anyone prepared for this? Not particularly. We are seeing a reshoring of production in the US, which is quite remarkable. It's stressing our workforce systems. It's beginning to, sort of change the spatial order of manufacturing and production in the US. This has enormous effects for Canada. I mean, enormous effects for Canada because of our partnerships. But it's still, upheaved. I mean, there was a New York Times article which talked about a snow globe just being shaken up. This was back in March of this year. The flakes have not settled, really. This is a new disorder. It is not a new normal. And I would say with regard to the housing sector and the production innovation sector, we are still going through sort of the, dynamics and the disruptions of all this. At the end of the day, the only folks who can really bring any order out of this chaos are city networks, metropolitan networks, corporate, civic, university, public, that really begin to understand in their own place what this all means. But, 1,000 days, whoa, this was no wonder we're all exhausted. If it was just COVID, that would be enough. COVID, Ukraine, financialization. I mean, George Floyd, just keep piling it on, right? So it's not surprising we're all exhausted, but I do think there's some opportunities out there and there's some urgency for us to respond to what is a different world, I think, in terms of who owns what and where is wealth going to be created.
Marcy, please forgive me, but I just want to jump in quickly to say to Bruce, Bruce, we were approached 3 months into the pandemic, 90 days into the 1,000 days by one of Canada's large institutional funds. And they said, are you doing something like building a REIT of church properties? And we said, no, but what if we were? Would you be interested? And are you trying to kill us or are you trying to help us? And I don't think we got the answer on that question, but the question's being asked, and I would just take everything you just said and put that same question, institutional ownership over properties that are currently social purpose real estate. They're up for grabs big time. They're vulnerable, and same wake up call, just copy paste. Thanks, Marcy.
Yeah, no problem, Graham. And I was going to say the financialization of housing is not unique to the US, obviously. We feel it here in Canada, and yeah, I think this whole notion of a new disorder as opposed to a new normal, yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot to chew on there. And so finally, Tim, over to you to talk about the COVID 1,000 days into it in New York.
Yes. So first of all, thank you, Mary and CY, for giving us a moment to pause and think about where we've been and where we're going. And I'm speaking my experience both in the having worked in the parks world, supporting parks and public and placemaking entities in New York, then having run the business improvement area and district for Times Square, and also being part of the International Downtown Association, which is the trade association of bids and BIAs. I'd say a few things. Both in terms of lessons and dividends. One is that it's a reminder that cities fundamentally still have to compete. And I think of Ed Glazer, Professor Ed Glazer's book, where he wrote Triumph of the City, and then a few years later in COVID wrote Survival of the City. Fundamentally, we've been reminded, and this is really, really important for the bigger climate change agenda, cities have to continue to compete effectively with suburban areas and areas that are car oriented if we're going to survive with climate change. And to do that, there's a bunch of things that they need to do that we had sort of forgotten about when cities were ascendant for the last 15 or 20 years, which, obviously education is key, affordable housing. Those are things that, as Bruce was just talking about, there's a lot of structural issues there that means that it takes time, if not decades, to solve some of those problems. Adequate and frequent public transit is critical. And then also, I would argue the quality of the public realm is a really critical thing where there can be a much shorter turnaround time in terms of those either getting better or significantly worse. And I think that we saw, whether it was in Vancouver or Halifax or Toronto, BIAs and placemaking entities playing a really, really critical role at the local level in managing and improving and protecting those spaces, not only when cities were struggling back in the 70s and 80s, but especially once again during COVID. Number two, I would say that while government got better at certain things, sometimes it got better by getting out of the way, and that in fact, those cracks that turned to chasms were reflections of the fact that government still isn't working in terms of complex problems at the local level. Think about policing, you think about public space management and the quality of the public space experience, think about dealing with people with addiction and mental health issues. What we saw is that actually, government overall, nationally, at a provincial level and locally, is still struggling to solve those problems. And in fact, there's a need for a new sets of solutions. The other, I think, lesson, but also dividend, is a greater recognition of the critical importance of the public realm, both in a positive sense and in a negative sense. The public realm, in a positive sense, as this place where how important it was to be able to gather in person, and how important sort of social interactions were to the life of the city and the building of trust, but also how critically important it is to make sure that the public space experience isn't negative, and that when it became more negative, that plays a really key role in a very visceral way in whether people want to stay or go from cities, along with those other larger term structural things. But the dividend is that there's a greater appreciation, I think, of that. Also, there was an additional a significant expansion of what people thought of the public realm with respect to streets and sidewalks. It started with things pre-COVID, like using more street spaces for public space, but with things like patio dining, outdoor dining, the closure of streets, when some of the automobile traffic receded, there was a new appreciation of how these spaces that were formerly just for transportation could be used for civic vibrancy, culture, and other things. And that a critical thing now for us to think about looking forward is we're heading into a time now where there's going to be incredible economic and fiscal stress on cities. And we already know that there's tremendous stress in terms of the experience of the public spaces. Who and what were the entities that really made a difference several decades ago when we were in a similar existential question about whether cities could survive? They were these placemaking entities. And it was in Toronto 50 years ago that BIAs were invented, a critical tool that actually had sustainable financing. Many public space, waterfront, and park entities, NGOs, were critical collaborators and network creators that made one-size-fits-all government work better at the local and neighborhood level, building the trust that we have seen is often so absent. But what we don't have is a really systematic policy and philosophical, legal, financial, and regulatory approach to how those partnerships and collaborations at the local level can be supported and catalyzed and funded in a sustainable way that works not just in prosperous downtowns and center cities, but in lower income areas as well. There's a lot of work to be done in that. Bruce has led much of that research talking about hyper-local government, but there's a lot more work to be done.
Great, thank you, Tim. That was excellent. Now we have about 5 minutes left, maybe a little bit over 5 minutes. Before I pass it over to Mary, I thought maybe we can use a lightning round of 45 seconds to a minute for if panelists want to respond to what other panelists have said. And maybe Kate, I can start with you because you've had the luxury of listening to folks respond to you, and so it'd be great to hear what if there's any reflections from what the panel has said.
Well, it's both interesting and a bit overwhelming actually hearing we all have various vantage points, and that's true of everyone broadly participating in the call as well, and are seeing different problems emerging. And so it feels like a very, very long list of things that need very, very urgent attention. And, many people talked about kind of the stresses and strains that people are under. And so figuring out how we collectively rally what's needed to solve these problems. We're all in different places and spaces. We're all aware of different challenges. And I think if one of the big takeaways is that people have more power than they think they do to change the things around them, it is going to be, I think, an exercise of really digging deep. So it's been interesting to hear the quite different vantage points on what are some of the challenges that we're left with now, what's needed, and what's the role of each of us as citizens to try to make change in the places where we are.
Great, thank you. Alicia.
I mean, maybe similar to what Kate is saying, what strikes me is I actually think we mostly have shared vision when I talk to folks, at least in the Bay Area, when I talk to folks about what is it that we are trying to create, this idea of a truly equitable, sustainable, thriving community is really commonly held. We also oftentimes have at least the starting points, the building blocks of what those policy interventions need to be. We know that we need to be thinking about guaranteed income as an example. I think where we really need to be focusing our time, and I appreciate Bruce's point about when nobody's in charge and also everybody's in charge. And so to me, where we really need to be focusing our time is in building out those cross-sector relationships. And I see this, our community foundations are taking a leading role in working with grassroots organizations to get them ready for the money that's coming from the federal government, but it's coming through the regional agencies and passing through counties and et cetera. And so for that whole ecosystem to work, it has to be on a foundation of relationship. And a lot of that relationship building actually happened during the course of the pandemic because it was forced to happen, because we had to respond quickly. And to kind of keep this moving forward, again, with a relatively shared vision and with a pretty clear set of steps, it does take that kind of coordinating all of the actors and allowing each actor to play to their strengths, because there is such a huge spectrum of need, ranging from the physical public realm to the social, to the more existential, climate impacts, et cetera. So that's kind of what I'm reflecting on listening to everybody's great points today.
Great, thank you, Alicia. And Peter, would you like to respond to anything you heard from the panelists?
Just great interventions from everybody. I'll go back to Graham. The quote from Peter Wilson, couldn't agree more. Resilient cities, resilient communities, and resilient individuals, families within those communities are the best crime prevention and any prevention effort that we're looking for in terms of health and social determinant of health outcomes. So that for me resonated a lot. It existed before the pandemic, probably just came to pure clarity as a result of it. The challenge, though, the other part I feared, I heard the term money come up. I used it, budgets. And if this quickly becomes a zero-sum game where we're trying to grab every last dollar that's about to come from this latest injection of federal cash, people way wiser than me have actually tracked the funding, certainly within Canada, and there are billions and billions of dollars in the system, more than enough to make the system operate at a far more optimal level. It's the system itself that's failing to operate optimally, not so much the funding. And I know some people will push back against that. Probably somewhere in between is the truth. If we can work better together, differently together, with existing resources, we can do so much more together for the people that really need that. And then when new funds do come in, because they are always needed, we'll do even better with those new funds. So I know nobody said it, but I just, caution, more money is not, more anything is not necessarily the solution for what we're dealing with. Better working together is always going to be the most sustainable solution what we're facing.
Thanks, Peter. I'm afraid we are out of time for the other reflection of panelists. So I apologize, Bruce, and I apologize, Tim. Graham, you did have your chance to weigh in a second time. So, Mary, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Marcy. Listen, such an interesting conversation. I want all afternoon with you. So if we just all go to the airport, we could meet somewhere. Maybe we'll meet in Chicago and I'll see you there for supper. The thing about this conversation, I know it's complex, and I appreciate you only got a little bit of time to kind of highlight these things, but this is a bit of a buffet today to just sort of start to identify what are the Gordian knots that we're going to try to tackle collectively. And I appreciate each of you suggesting that. And this notion that we double down on the local and then figure out what those collaborative relationships are. We had to develop some good collaborative muscles in the crisis. Now we have to figure out how to keep those muscles going, right? So I so appreciate that. A number of you, and listen, I know your phone numbers, so we're never losing track of any of you because it's such a vital conversation that we're all in together, and you all have different perspectives. So I appreciate that. So thanks for taking the time, Alicia. Great to see you. Hope you're coming to Toronto soon. I hope so again. Graham, always important to hear the sector's perspective and the challenges that that's facing. Peter, we are looking forward a lot to having you as a fellow here, and the whole reimagining of community safety, because I think this is, let's hope that's a legacy coming out of COVID, is that we have to have a new lens on that. Tim, you're right. BIA's founded in Canada. Thanks for that little shout out. Downtowns and economies are critically linked, as Bruce made very clear to us. It's all about the economy and jobs. And now we've got to deal with financial aid. I appreciate, Bruce, your litany of fatigue. And another thing, and what's next? Frogs, pestilence. Thank you for the shout outs that all of you provided to placemaking, because that is the session we're leading to now, and how it really can start with places and people in places. You're all in that business, and we're all about the physical and the social, and how the city means where people and place meet. So Kate, always great to have you. Thanks always for your analysis here. And I'll see you soon in 2023. The work only gets going. It gets